This lesson examines Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 after we first take a general look at the writings of Moses as a whole. And there will be links to all of these things in the video description. And we have to study the Bible with all the context in mind, and we have to begin with Genesis with some general information about all first 5 books of the Bible, which are called the books of Moses, or the Torah, or the Pentateuch. And the Bible itself attributes those things to Moses. But we have 2 links here that I want to show about the writers themselves in the New Testament, but the Old. And they have, according to the laws of well, not laws, but habits of modern scholarship, that they look at the first 5 books of Moses as it can't be what it says it is, so we have to think of something else. And there's this theory called the JEDP hypothesis, and this link explains what that is all about, and it's called also the documentary hypothesis, liberal critical view which denies that Moses wrote Genesis to Deuteronomy. And this is still taught today, even in seminaries. And the J stands for, whoops, this is rolling a little faster than I want, Yahwist, if you pronounce it sort of right, that gathered myths and legends of Babylon and other nations and added them to campfire stories of the Hebrews. And it's based on the what's called the Tetragrammaton, the YHWH, or the, what the letters are in Hebrew. And it really is kind of an acronym that stands for I am who I am. But this is roughly translated or transliterated Jehovah or Yahweh, and they named the J theory after that. E is for Elohist, the habit of the writer to use Elohim for God. D is Deuteronomy, that whoever wrote Deuteronomy wrote all the other books. And then P is the priestly theory that this was all just moral codes, and that these were all put together by an anonymous redactor, R, who assembled the whole thing and put it into one. And they go into the history on this page of how these theories were developed, and that this was all based upon the theory of evolution, that everything evolves. So assuming that, first of all, by faith, then they tried to apply it to everything, social constructs, documents, everything, history, everything is evolving. That, of course, is patently false. There's plenty of evidence that history, especially, is not one unbroken line from simple to complex. So they looked to apply evolutionary theory to the Bible, and this is one of the things they came up with. But the facts are, and the evidence are, that Moses himself was the grand editor of these first 5 books. So we have clay tablets with writings on them that, one objection is writing hadn't been invented, and that, of course, is false. Writing was invented long time before Moses. And it also, by the way, they point out that the Torah means law. And the hypothesis, the JEDP hypothesis, falsely assumes that the Israelites waited until many centuries after the foundation of their nation before committing any of their history or laws to written form, which is ridiculous. And there's internal evidence, external evidence that you can read here in this document, and the fact that Jesus and the New Testament referred to those writings as the laws of Moses, or the writings of Moses, or Moses was the chief of authority there. So you can read also about the different words for God, and there's even a verse which says Yahweh Elohim in one sentence of 2 words together. So how could they be different writers? This is the names of God being the basis for different writers is just patently false and ridiculous. So, as I said, you can read most of those facts here. You can also read more of similar information at this link, the second writer link in the description. And they further corroborate the evidence of the first link, and you can find all of these things on the internet on your own. I encourage you to do that, to look up the issue, the evidence pro and con for who wrote the books of Moses. So the point is that the New Testament refers to them as such, and that's a better witness than anything else. And we have evidence of writing that is way earlier than Moses and so forth. So there's no reason to have doubt that Moses wrote these books. So let's now go to a chart. I want to quickly mention this video on something I've mentioned in other lessons about the timelines. So don't forget to look into that. And there were about 500, if you've watched the video, you will see there were about 560 years from the birth of Jacob and Israel to the Exodus. And I'm thinking now, there is a chart on this page. They had the narrative here. There we go. That's the chart I was looking for. And this especially will show the ones I have in green are the important names that the Bible says are important by giving their age at the next generation's birth, the certain person in that generation, and then the total lifespan of that person. So there were 560 years from the birth of Jacob, who is also called Israel, to the Exodus. And I think that was in this one. Anyway, look on this page for charts. Sorry about that. If the Exodus occurred around 1446 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh of Egypt by the name of Amenhotep II, which there's debate, but that seems to be the most reasonable view in my opinion, then the Pentateuch was likely written around 1400 BC. If so, the language was likely to have been something called Proto-Sinaitic from Sinai or the land of Canaan, and that was followed by Paleo-Hebrew, the earliest known form of Hebrew writing that we have fragments of, and that eventually was translated into Greek and the Greek Septuagint, as I've mentioned before in other lessons. So it was not written, most likely, originally in some form of Hebrew, although some articles will tell you that this was Hebrew. So it's a kind of a semantic argument, but the point is that it is, if you want to look at the language the Old Testament was originally written in, it was likely something called Proto-Sinaitic. Okay, so check out this article. It has some good information, some good charts. Always consider the source, but also let an article stand or fall on its arguments and its evidence. And again, you can look into these genealogy charts and the reason that the article uses for choosing certain names. And they look into possible ranges of lifespans and ages at which someone was born. And so these are all factors that people study to determine how many years. And they conclude that there were indeed 430 years from the sojourn of Israel, as they call it, from the time of being in Egypt to the time to the Promised Land. So they also go into the definition of what a generation is and so forth. So now let's go to this link about the Pentateuch. And we see here that this is Bible.org. They have a lot of good information. I don't always agree with everything they have there, but this one is pretty good on the Torah if you want to look into that in more detail. And there's something here called Patterns of Evidence as well that has good information on the languages. So if you want to learn more about the specific languages, you can look at the Phoenicians and so forth that academia typically offers as the first, but that's not necessarily true. So all of these articles, it's interesting the way they have the photos slide in there, but look into this article. I'm merely providing this evidence so you can do your own research and get you started on your own discovery of how languages developed. And this is kind of speculation here on the left column that this is the article that I was thinking of, that talking about people saying that original language was Hebrew, but certainly not. It's kind of a misleading statement, because it's certainly not Hebrew as we know it today, the square script on the left. It was more like hieroglyphics. These were pictograms of certain animals or people or water, whatever it was, that developed into characters in an alphabet. So you can kind of follow a progression from right to left there on some of these characters, but that doesn't mean the original language was called Hebrew. It's just speculation on their part. But they do think that in this article, that it all developed from Egyptian hieroglyphics. I can't speak today. Hieroglyphics. And so take that as you will. Look into the evidence, and that's the point of showing you these articles, is you'll look into the evidence. So, if I can get back to my notes here, study these things for yourself. And now what I'd like to do is read through Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, and they should be all in the same chapter. By context, it seems pretty obvious. What I have up here is an interlinear of the Greek at BibleHub.com, and I'm going to let you read that. I would encourage you to have that up in a different window on a browser while you listen to what I'm saying, because what I'm going to do is put this into how I understand it in modern English. Okay, I'm not trying to replace the Bible or anything, or change anything, or I wouldn't show you the Greek. But you can also read the Masoretic text. But in the previous lesson, we discussed the problems with relying too much on the Masoretic text, which is not original Hebrew in the slightest. So I'm going to read through this and paraphrase it, and to try to bring it to life, because translation's purpose is to communicate, and you can't do that with just a dictionary with a word-for-word rendering. An interlinear will get you as close to word for word as possible without knowing the languages, but even so, you can hover over any of these Strong's numbers and get a quick definition of each word. But it's a very, very brief definition. You really need to look into it. At any rate, I'm going to just leave that up. I'm not going to try to scroll through it. It's too slow. So go ahead and bring that up in a browser window and follow along. And I'm just going to, like I said, read through this real quick and try to keep the lesson from getting too long. So here we go with Genesis 1 through 5, and I'll break it up by the days of creation. Okay, so in the beginning, God made the sky and earth. And I'll just stop to point out that the word for sky and heaven are the same Greek word, uranos, uranon. They only will show you heaven here, but it means sky. It depends on how you want to define that, but in modern English, we tend to define heaven as where God is. And that's not what is meant here by the context at all. It means the sky. The sky can extend all the way out to whatever might be the farthest object in the sky, but it's not where God is, and that's the point. So, in the beginning, God made the sky and earth. At first, the earth was a vast and featureless watery abyss, dark and invisible. But the Spirit of God compressed the water, and God gave a command, "Let light appear." It did, and God was pleased with this. So he divided light from darkness, calling them day and night, and evening and morning passed the first day. And then verses 6 through 8. God then gave a command, "Let there be a strong support to divide the waters." So he made the strong support, putting some water above it and the rest below. He called the strong support sky, and he was pleased with this. Evening and morning passed the second day. God then gave a command. This is starting verse 9. "Let the waters beneath the sky gather into one place so that dry land can appear." It happened as God commanded. The waters gathered themselves and dry land appeared. God called the dry land earth and the waters seas, and he was pleased with this. Then God gave another command. "Now let the earth produce pasture plants with seeds to make more just like itself. The same for trees, let them have seed-bearing fruit." So it was done. Plants appeared with their seed to reproduce, and trees appeared bearing fruit with seed to reproduce. God was pleased with this, and evening and morning passed the third day. Then down in verse 14. God then gave a command, let there be luminaries in the strong support of the sky, to give light on the earth and to distinguish between day and night. Let them also serve as signs, and to mark off times, days, and years. So it was done. God made the two primary luminaries, the greater one to mark the beginnings of days, and the lesser one to mark the beginnings of nights, and the stars. He put them in the strong support of the sky to shine on the earth and mark the beginnings of days and nights, and to separate light from darkness. God was pleased with this, and evening and morning passed the fourth day. Now in verse 20. God then gave a command, let living souls that crawl emerge from the waters, and let creatures with wings fly on the earth under the strong support of the sky. So it was done. God made huge sea creatures along with the crawling things and winged creatures with feathers, each according to its own kind. God was pleased with this, and he blessed them with these words, grow and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, and let the flying creatures also multiply on the earth. Evening and morning passed the fifth day. Verse 24. God then gave a command, let all of these living souls emerge from the earth, each according to its kind, those with 4 feet, those that crawl, and wild animals. So it was done. God made all of these according to each one's kind, the wild animals of the earth, the cattle, and all that crawl on the earth. God was pleased with this. God then gave a command, let us make human, like us, not only in form but also in function, having authority over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle all over the earth, and those that crawl on the earth. So human was made, male and female, resembling God. He blessed them with these words, grow and multiply, fill the earth and dominate it. Have control over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle all over the earth, and everything that crawls on the earth. God added, look, I've given food from the earth's seed-bearing plants and trees with seed-bearing fruit. This is not only for you, but also for the wild animals on the earth, the birds of the sky, and everything that crawls on the earth. Everything having the breath of life will have all the green plants for food. So it was done, and God was very pleased with it all. Evening and morning passed the sixth day. And then into chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, this completed the sky and earth, the entire system. On the sixth day, God finished the task of creation. So on the seventh day, he rested from that work. That's why God pronounced a blessing on that day and set it apart from the rest. That's how I see the initial creation week narrative. And the point to remember is that in ancient Near East tradition or practice, they would introduce their work with a summary of the whole thing and then go back and add detail. Some people think that there are 2 creation accounts, that chapter 2 somehow, starting in verse 4, is another creation account added by someone later, but that's not true at all. If they had studied ancient Near East practice, they would know this. So there were not 2 creation accounts. It's the introduction followed by the detail. But it's pretty interesting to go through this interlinear yourself and see what some of the words are in the Greek Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint isn't perfect, neither is the Masoretic text certainly, but it's good to take a fresh look at things, especially on the older documents that are less likely to have had changes crept into them. People will say something was removed, but the more likely scenario in any argument over the context of the Bible or content of the text itself is that things get added, not that things get subtracted. And the problem is that people don't realize that when something is copied, especially in very ancient times when copying was all done by hand, usually by one person standing in a room reading to a bunch of other people writing it down, that sometimes marginal notes were made as well. And not only is people hearing something wrong, but also marginal notes are made. And then later, when someone makes a copy from the copy, they aren't always sure which is a marginal note and which goes in the text. So they err on the side of caution and put the marginal notes in the text, and that's how things get added. And you will notice also that since the canon of the Bible was pretty well finished, that people have tried to add to it. There are a few who have tried to subtract, but most people tried to add to it. Gnostic works, intertestamental works, the Apocrypha, the Pseudographica, I can't pronounce anything today. But anyway, the point is that older documents have the advantage of showing what was most likely original and what later on was likely added by copyist errors or by someone simply explaining. For example, in the New Testament, we have the account of the pool of Bethsaida, however you pronounce that, and there is an explanation of what that pool was that, by all accounts, was probably not in the original. Even if it was, it doesn't materially affect the meaning of the text. It's just explanation for people who would not be familiar with what was going on at that pool, that it was a pool of healing. So it helps the reader. And whether that was part of the inspired text or not, the point is that it's actually true, and it helps the reader understand context. And so whenever we put the Bible into modern terms, as I just did with my reading, we're helping to add context not only of the originals that are often lost in translation because of very strict rules, but we're also making the point of translation, which is to understand. And as I've explained in previous lessons, that's a good thing. It's the point of communication. It's the point of language. It's the point of writing. So I hope this helped in some way, this reading of Genesis, the early chapters, and the discussion of the first 5 books of Moses and why they're attributed to Moses. And that the point being that it is often the primary person involved and not necessarily who actually had the pen in their hand. Okay, so because in any part of the Bible, any ancient document, whenever something is ascribed to an individual, it's not necessarily that this person did the actual writing, but that they were the primary subject or authority. So when we look at the New Testament, especially the words of Jesus quoting from the Pentateuch, and they attribute it to Moses, it means by or about or on the authority of Moses. That's why they say it's the writings of Moses, and they say Moses said this and Moses said that, because he is the chief authority of those writings. We could also look at the book of Esther as an example. Certainly only Esther, if you're familiar at all with that book, I hope so, only Esther herself could know many of the details. But it's unlikely that she herself wrote the words down, because in her position as queen, it's almost guaranteed that a scribe would have written it for her. But they would have done so accurately and wrote what she told them to write. And at least some of the material that is in the book of Esther likely came from her older cousin Mordecai, who actually raised her when her parents apparently died. But he supplied information on some of his actions that are reported in the book. And this hardly invalidates the historical accuracy of the account, because we know that Mordecai supplied information, Esther supplied information, but the book is all about Esther. That's why it's called the Book of Esther. So it doesn't matter that Esther herself didn't write it. It came from her as the authority, the primary authority of the information and actions that are about her that she actually did. So it's a valid book, and it's called Esther because it's about her. So we can extend this same principle to the entire Bible, that especially with the issue of the Pentateuch and its author being attributed to Moses. It's the same principle. It's about Moses as the primary authority. It's attributed to him as the one who may have been the grand editor of it all. He certainly got information from long before his time from some other records. I mean, he goes back to Creation Week, and as I said, he likely wrote these books around 1400 BC, and the creation was long before that. So Moses himself is not writing as an eyewitness to any of these creation events that we went over today. Nobody alive at the time of the writing would have been alive at the time of creation week. Only Adam and Eve were anyway, for at least this, actually the first 2 chapters of Genesis. So that's why they're called the books of Moses, and that's why they're attributed to Moses, and it doesn't make them less factual. Moses was highly educated by Egypt. He was, Pharaoh's grandson, actually, by adoption, snatched from the river, so to speak. And that's why, we can say that he was qualified to do such a thing. He was very literate, very educated, and a Hebrew. So this is why he is even given more importance when you think about it than Abraham. Abraham was the chief patriarch, but when it comes to the nation of Israel, they look at the patriarchs, and God identifies himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, and Jacob, his name was changed to Israel by God. And from Jacob's 12 sons came the 12 tribes of Israel. But they all talk about Moses as an authority on words from God. And this is why. Moses was the one to write from the beginning with authority from the ancient documents, and he was well qualified to do so. Anyway, we will conclude our lesson of Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, and next time look at least chapter 2, possibly also chapter 3 of Genesis. Hope to see you in the next lesson.